Can you hear me? Oh, there I am. Just love the sound of my own voice. It's terrible. How's everybody doing tonight? Oh my God, it's a little loud for a library, but we'll let it slide this one time. Thank you so much for coming out to our first Live from NYPL event of the fall. My name is Aiden Flax-Clark. I'm the director of Live from NYPL, so you think I should be able to say it by now, but apparently I can't. But thank you to everyone who's here with us in the room. Thank you to everyone who's watching online. I couldn't think of a better way to start up again in the fall than with Myriam Gurba talking about her incredible new book, Creep, right? Yeah. And this is only the first of many events this fall. We're going to have this month talking about climate fiction with Nathaniel Rich, Akhil Kumarasamy, and Sam J. Miller. We'll learn about AI and global policy with the brilliant Alondra Nelson. We're going to hear from the stars of the Met Opera's new production of Dead Man Walking and the woman who inspired it, Sister Helen Prejean. We'll hear about other amazing new books from Vauhini Vara, Hector Tobar, C-Pam Zhang, Mary Beard, and many more. We're going to experience stories of Heart Island with our friends from PRX's Radio Diaries, celebrate our annual literary Halloween costume contest with our other friend, Tim Gunn, and we're going to mark the 100th anniversary of Khalil Gibran's The Prophet with Tony Shalhoub and other special guests. And believe it or not, there's a whole lot more past that. So please go to nypl.org/live, see what we have going on, register, and hopefully we'll see you there. Everything is free, so, it's not much of a barrier. But here we are tonight with Myriam Gurba coming up on the stage in a minute to talk about Creep, and she's going to speak with writer and editor Julianne Escobedo Shepherd. Creep, as you hopefully saw, is available for sale outside. This book is so good. Please purchase it. You are not going to be sorry. It's really amazing. And I believe Myriam will be signing it afterward. And, of course, if you have a library card, everyone has a library card, right? All right. We give you trouble here if you don't have a library card. You can reserve the book. I'm sure all the copies are checked out because it's very popular, but you can reserve it, or you could check out some of Myriam's other books like Mean or Painting Their Portraits in Winter, or you could check out some of the books that she very kindly recommended to all of us, which you can find in your printed program or on the event listing. And if you carry the shame of not having a library card, it's fine. Go to any desk at any branch or go online to nypl.org/library card and, get rid of your shame. Okay, at the end of the conversation, Myriam will take some of your questions. Hopefully you saw that you've got some note cards here. You can write those questions down at any time. Some of my colleagues will come by to collect them periodically. And if you're watching online, you can email publicprograms@nypl.org, or you can put your question in the chat on YouTube, and we will get those as well. And we'll make sure that they all get up to Myriam, and she'll answer as many as she can at the end. All right. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Ispahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and of course by all of you. So thank you again for being with us. And let's please welcome Julianne Escobedo Shepherd and Myriam Gurba.
Hi, everyone. Hello, hello, hello.
Hi.
I'm going to read a brief excerpt from the first essay in this collection. The essay is titled Tell. And this essay sets the tone for the entire collection. It focuses on games that children play, and as the collection proceeds, the stakes that games people play get higher and higher and more dangerous. Tell. It's easy to get sucked into playing morbid games. When I was little, I happily went along with a few. I played one with Renee Jr., the daughter of the woman who gave me my second perm. She and Renee Sr. lived in a tall apartment building across the street from the used bookstore where I sometimes spent my allowance. Sycamore trees towered in a nearby park, and when their leaves turned penny-colored and crunchy, falling and carpeting the grass, they created the illusion that we lived somewhere that experienced passionate seasons. Santa Maria's seasons could be hard to detect. The closest we came to getting snow were whispers of frost that half-dusted our station wagon's windshield, hardly enough to write your name in. Renee Sr.'s face was as gorgeous as my mother's. The scar above her lip accented her beauty. Above her living room TV hung a framed cross-stitch, "God bless our pad." I sat on a black dining room chair in the kitchen, trying to look out the window above the sink. The sky was a boring blue. Cars chugged along Main Street. A gust of wind sent sycamore leaves scattering. Renee Sr. gathered my hair in her hands, winding it around rollers. The ragged cash my mother had paid her was stacked on the kitchen counter. Beside the money, chicken thighs defrosted. My feet rubbed the spotless linoleum floor. I liked the sensation of my tight socks gliding against it. "Hold still," said Renee Sr. "Quit squirming." Renee Sr. had a perm and an odd, impatient voice. She sounded how I imagined an ant would, dangerously high-pitched, venomous. Once her mother was done setting my hair, a grinning Renee Jr. waved at me, inviting me to her bedroom. I accepted. Renee Jr. had inherited her mother's beauty, accented by long teeth instead of a naughty scar. Renee Jr. and I knelt on her chocolate-colored carpet. The apartment, including her room, smelled of buttered flour tortillas and fabric softener. The scent made me feel held, safe, and I couldn't wait to rinse the perm solution out of my hair so that I could sniff that fragrance again. The stuff Renee Sr. had squirted on me made my head stink and my scalp burn. Renee Jr. dumped a pile of Barbie dolls between us. Lifting one by her asymmetrical page boy, I asked, "You're allowed to cut their hair?" Renee Jr. petted a blonde and nodded. "They're mine," she said. "I can do whatever I want to them." I tried not to act envious. I was not allowed to cut my doll's hair or my own. My mother had put that rule in place after I tried giving myself Cleopatra bangs. With the bedroom door closed, Renee Jr.'s dolls enacted scenes inspired by US and Latin American soap operas. They yelled, wept, shook, and made murderous threats. They lied and broke promises. They trembled, got naked, and banged stiff pubic areas. Clack, clack, clack. Some of you have done this before, haven't you? Like, don't be sitting there all innocent. They slapped and bit. They hurt one another on purpose and laughed instead of apologizing. They cheated, broke up, got back together, and cheated again. They were lesbians. They had no choice. Renee Jr. had no male dolls. Renee Jr. carried a distraught lesbian to the open window. I hurried after her. She shrieked, "I can't take it anymore, I'm gonna jump." Silhouetted against the boring blue, we watched the doll go up, pause, and then plummet. Face first, she smacked the ground unceremoniously. She's dead, I thought. Renee Jr. and I looked at each other, smiled. We had discovered something fun. Throwing dolls out the window and watching them fall 10 stories was something we probably weren't supposed to be doing. Soon, All of Renee Jr.'s dolls were scattered along the sidewalk beneath her window, contorted in death poses, and we had nothing left to play with but ourselves.
Love that. I actually was going to point out that I think the way that you describe Barbie's humping, the clack, is like a perfect, it's so simple, but it's like, that's exactly what it sounded like.
That's what lives in my imagination is the clacking.
Yeah. I don't know. No one else has done this? Okay. So you, before you started reading, you mentioned the stakes of the games that people play rising throughout the book. And I wonder how that relates to just the idea of tackling the creep as an entity or as an idea.
Definitely. So I opened with games and these sort of low stakes death games that children play because I thought that this would likely be relatable for a lot of readers. Mm-hmm. So many of us play at macabre and morbid games during childhood, and those macabre, morbid games often veer toward comedy. Mm-hmm. And then I ramp up, I scale up, and the stakes begin to change as the book progresses. And what I do is I attempt to demonstrate how it is that the games that we're invited to play as we mature are sometimes deceptive games and games whose stakes we don't completely understand. But that those childhood games that we play that are morbid are our entry point mm-hmm. into those other more serious games.
So, and usually those, I mean, just from reading your book, it seems like the answer is usually those stakes are perpetrated by creeps.
Absolutely, yeah. So, for example, later on in that essay, Tell, I describe a game that was played by a Mexican president, mm-hmm. Salinas de Gortari. He played a war game as a child and captured a captive who was a domestic worker in the home, and he shot her dead mm-hmm. as part of the game. And when I was researching, I could not locate her whereabouts, the victim's whereabouts. She disappeared after that. Then I contrast that to Joan Vollmer, the wife mm-hmm. of William Burroughs, and the very high stakes and now mythologized game that she was invited to play with him. Mm-hmm. And then I ramp up from there and describe a game that I was invited to play by an ex-boyfriend. And then that game turned into an extremely dangerous situation. Mm-hmm.
The way that you write sort of in this book and in most of these essays combines the first person, the personal, but also weaving together a lot of historical research and mm-hmm. elements, and often you reframe them in ways that where the person who's usually been written out of the story, usually the girl or the woman,
yes,
has been disappeared, and you sort of bring new life into their stories. I wonder about your decision to do that, like Joan Vollmer.
Absolutely.
Or Manuela, who is
the victim of the president, mm-hmm. as a child. So I approached Creep as a counter-narrative, and there are true crime elements to a lot of the essays, but what I find incredibly frustrating about true crime is that so often victims become a footnote, and the perpetrator becomes the main character. Mm-hmm. And I don't want for the perpetrator to be the main character. I want for us to understand who the victim is and to restore her story. So there are various gestures. So I do that for Joan Vollmer. I also do that for Lorena Gallo. Most people refer to her by Lorena Bobbitt, but after her divorce, she reverted back to Gallo, and I'm gonna honor her by calling her that. I'm not gonna use that asshole's name. So, so I've taken these various figures and made them the main character that they deserve to be.
It's interesting to hear you describe this as true crime and Mean you described as a true crime memoir, because I think what has become so common in the vernacular of true crime is not only the centering of the perpetrator, but also this sort of almost fetishization of victimhood in certain ways, and a lot of that ties into like white womanhood. And I wonder, because a lot of what you do is really I mean, you know, like you just said, kind of bringing the victim to the forefront. And I wonder what you think about that and sort of how you relate to calling what you do true crime.
I feel conflicted about referring to what I do as true crime. And what I do definitely has true crime elements, and I'm building on true crime. But I'm also attempting to complicate true crime and, in a sense, kind of tear it down and rebuild it. I'm not sure if that's possible to do with the genre, but I like to sort of cherry pick elements of the genre. Another aspect of the genre that I find really problematic is that it tends to be really propagandistic. Yeah. So unless the criminal legal system is involved and is either a main character or an adjacent main character, then typically work doesn't get considered true crime. There's so much work that gets considered true crime. For example, I have a very good friend, Wendy Ortiz, who wrote a memoir titled Excavation about a horrendous relationship that an adult initiated with her at age 13. There's an absence of the criminal legal system in that memoir, but I think that that memoir should be called true crime because of what was done to her.
For sure. And you also have an essay called Locas, which is about basically the history of mass incarceration of Mexican Americans in Los Angeles. And also you relay that through your cousin. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So Locas is a very different essay compared with the rest of the collection, because that essay was commissioned by my cousin. So my cousin hit me up, and and she said to me, she said, you know, Myriam, I don't like what's been written about me by crime reporters. I don't like the paper trail created by the state of California that pigeonholes me as a felon. And crime reporters have robbed me of my origin story. I'm simply the woman who was going to rob Walmart with a shotgun. You know, who was the girl though? Nobody says when I grow up I want to rob Walmart with a shotgun. You know what I mean? So she told me, she said, I want to explain how I transformed from a child with an aspiration to be a school teacher to serving time alongside Susan Atkins. So I worked with her, and we did a series of interviews, and I attempted to give her back her story, and she's pretty satisfied.
Satisfied customer. Yeah. So, you know, I think there's a lot of humor in your writing, and there's also a lot of heaviness in your writing. And what is it, and including that essay, and what is it for you to take something that serious and that heavy, but also, you know, your family member who you love and doing right by them? Like, how do you approach that as a writer? Did that make sense?
Yes, absolutely. So for this book, I used techniques that I have not used before in terms of writing. And I made a lot of ancestral appeals when I was working on this book. So I have various altars set up around my house, actually 4 altars. And one of them is entirely devoted to my ancestors. And so I spent a lot of time at that altar asking for guidance. And so I do feel as if their hands assisted and guided the entire collection, but those hands were especially active when I was writing about our family. And so when I was writing about Desiree, I was talking to our grandmother and our great-grandmother and appealing to all these ancestral matriarchs for guidance, for literary guidance.
Wow, that's real. You actually also have a part in an essay about your grandfather where you talk about his hands kind of guiding yours, I think, is that the line?
Yeah. So in that essay, I describe the death of my grandmother, and I describe the rosary that was held for her at a church, and I couldn't attend the rosary because earlier that day I had eaten a pig's foot that disagreed with me. And it felt like I was trying to escape. So I was like, I should stay home. So I stayed home, and then I had a spectral experience. I'll refer to it that way. Yeah. And my grandfather had died a few months prior. And so their spirits were still very, very present. Like my grandmother hadn't even been gone for 48 hours. And so they were there in the house.
Yeah.
And I write about an encounter with my grandfather in spirit form.
It's interesting too because you write that essay. It's the way that you wrote it is different from all of the other.
Yes.
Like just from a form.
Yes.
Perspective, like it's spaced out.
Yeah. Structurally, it's really different, and the reason for that is that my grandfather was a publicist. And he loved to talk about himself, right? That he was the thing he most loved to publicize. He had also he had gone to seminary in order to acquire an education. He came from a peasant family and an indigenous family, and so he had to go to seminary in order to achieve what would be the equivalent of like a high school or an early college education. And when he was in seminary, he had a classmate named Juan Rulfo, who is a Mexican novelist. And my grandfather became incredibly envious of Rulfo's success because his mother had predicted that he would be successful in that way. So his mother predicted success correctly, just not her son's, you know. So the essay that is an homage and also a critique of the way that my grandfather lived takes tropes from Rulfo's writing and uses them to structure the telling of my grandfather's life. And in a way, it's a joke on my grandfather. But it's also to honor him. Yeah. But it's like, I'm going to honor you, but I'm also going to get in a little, you know. So.
Yeah. I kind of got that in that essay where you were talking about him telling stories about how he was, he had to reject La Doña.
Yes. Yeah, for those who might not be familiar, Maria Felix was like the Mexican sex symbol, right? And my grandfather has a story about how he had to fight her off. Like, this is the kind of person my grandfather was. Yeah.
It's such a good story. But as far as also just sort of writing about your family, you know, there's a lot of sort of critique of systems, and also a little bit of critique of your family.
Absolutely.
And
I don't let anybody off the hook.
you definitely don't.
No, not even myself. Like,
No. And that's, I think, why, I think why it feels so real. I think because you're not kind of like, you're looking at everything with open eyes. Just how do you make sure that you do that? Like, because I think as a writer, sometimes it's easy to kind of try and like scoot by or elide, things that are uncomfortable. How do you get deep? And you write about plenty that's uncomfortable. How do you get deep into that and protect yourself?
I don't know that I do a very good job of protecting myself when I do that sort of work. But I am committed to honesty and truth-telling, especially when it's incredibly difficult. And I do it out of care. Like, I do it out of care for others. And when I was writing Creep, one of the goals that I had in mind was to engage in sociological storytelling, but in such a way that it didn't seem to be sociological storytelling. So I hope that as readers come to this book, they have a sense of a conversation that's sort of happening on the page, but that is truly a conversation that is sort of slicing and dicing systems.
I'm like, you've stunned me.
Okay.
Mainly because mainly because you do, I think you do that, and I guess it is sort of like sneaky in there, but like there's so much breadth. Like, you have so many different approaches for each essay, and the storytelling in it is just captivating the entire time.
Thank
so
you.
I was thinking about the sociological aspect, but I mean, like, I told you I wanted to talk about Itchy because it is a little place in my heart of disdain. Do you want to?
I'm excited to talk about that essay because nobody has asked me about it yet.
It is wild, and it feels very like well, why don't you explain what it is?
I'll go ahead and explain like the inspiration for this essay called Itchy. So I taught high school for a long time, for like over 10 years. And one of the last years that I was in the classroom, I had a student just hanging out with me, right? So he's hanging out and he's sitting on this little like chaise lounge that I used to keep in the classroom, and he looked really glum. And I was like, "What's wrong?" And then he said, he named a teacher who worked down the hall, and he goes, "She doesn't like Mexicans." I was like, "Excuse me?" and I said, "How do you know? What has she done? Has she said something?" And so he proceeded to tell me that he had gone to class. This was a history teacher. He had gone to class. He had been wearing a baseball cap. And one of the school rules was that you need to take off your cap when you go into a classroom, right? So the kid had followed the rules. So he put his cap down, and the teacher snapped at him and said, "Put that back on." And the boy was really surprised because he's being invited to break the rules by his teacher. And so the boy said, "Why do I have to do that?" And she said, "Mexicans have lice. I don't want you spreading lice in my room." I was pissed. I was fucking pissed. So, so Itchy is about that incident, but it frames it historically.
Yeah.
And I examine the history of school segregation in California and the history of moralizing hygiene. And the essay takes us to Orange County, it takes us to El Paso, and it takes us to Auschwitz.
If you haven't read it, obviously it's very, I think, very good at connecting all of those things. And also it has a very clear, even despite all of the villains in it, it also has a very clear villain in the teacher. By the end, I was just like, I know this
Right? Like everybody, well, maybe not everybody, but most of us know a teacher like that who should not be teaching. Most of us know multiple teachers like that who shouldn't be teaching. Yeah.
Yes. But I mean, I think you do this throughout the book. There are all these histories of what Mexican Americans have gone through in this country, and I think that, you know, they're not as widely known, I think.
Absolutely.
And what was important about putting these stories into the book?
The stories were really important to add to the book because for somebody like me who grows up in, and I suppose what you could call the Southwest, there's an absence of this sort of storytelling. And so we now can, you know, some of us can now locate ourselves within the covers of a book like this. Yeah. I also think that stories about Mexicans and Mexican Americans are occulted, ignored, sidestepped in the United States as a result of colonialism, right? This was indigenous land, and it is indigenous land. And on the western side of the United States, the Spanish colonized, and then the Mexicans colonized. And then you had the United States invade and take a huge swath of land. And I think that there's a great deal of guilt that Anglo-Americans have about that. And I think Anglo-Americans do not like to be reminded of that. And I think that when sometimes they even look at a Mexican, there might be a bit of a, ugh.
Yeah, there's
like, I dispossessed and that's why I'm here.
Yeah.
And that's something people have to reckon with, but the only way they can reckon with it is through understanding the history.
That's actually a really good segue into your Joan Didion essay, which I think, you know, you write in an essay called The White Onion about kind of taking back this narrative of, you know, Joan Didion owns California. And obviously it's interesting because she's an author that I don't think I've barely ever read any critiques of her, ever. She's sort of this sacred person on the mount, and obviously she was incredibly talented, but there were some problems, which you elucidate in your excellent essay, which was, I felt like I'd been waiting my whole reading life to read. So yeah, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So my relationship to Didion is love-hate, and I describe in the essay how it was that I encountered her. I was taking an AP English class, I think it was AP Lit, and we were marched into the library, and we had several excerpts from various books that we had to analyze. And one of the excerpts was from Los Angeles Notebook. And I was shaken by that excerpt because I had never encountered it before, and I had never encountered writing about California that felt so accurate. Like just the accuracy was delicious, right? And because of that accuracy, there was a high level of relatability to like the topography and the weather that she was describing. And to see California portrayed on the page like that as the main character was enthralling. And I thought to myself, like, oh, okay, so California is deserving. California is a muse. California is a main character. Maybe I can interact with California similarly. And so Didion really lodged in my mind as a potential muse. And years later, I began to like consume her essays very voraciously. But I began to also be bothered by the racism in the work. And so the essay opens with a description of my introduction to Didion, how she sort of found me. And then I go into a critique of her fiction and her nonfiction. And I pay particular attention to the Mexican presence throughout her work.
There's a lot.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate.
Yeah.
I think that I mean, this whole book is indicative of your bravery and the fire with which you write. But that, on one hand, I think is interesting to me because, you know, you're not. The honesty lends itself to honesty about everything, including the sacred, you know, patron saint of the essay or whatever.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it so bothers me that she's considered like the Queen of California.
Yeah.
Because I don't like royalty. Like,
Yeah.
you know what I mean? Like, also, there should never be one person who speaks for an entire region. Like,
Yeah.
what's that about? Like, no monopoly on voice.
No, it's weird.
So, so I certainly give her some flowers in the essay. Like, I say that she mentored me in condescension and coolness.
Yeah.
But, you know, and then I proceed to sort of mimic her voice and then eviscerate her with it, you know? So she taught me well.
You're so good. So there is, in the title essay, your final essay, it's probably one of the most moving things that I've ever read in my life. And you write a lot about the reader bearing witness to things that happen to you. You sort of chronicle the writing of Mean, which if you have not read Mean, it's brilliant and difficult, but true. And I see you as bearing witness in your other essays, and I wonder what bearing witness as an author, a writer, and an essayist means to you. Is that very broad?
It is, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of narrow that down to that essay and describe sort of the process of bearing witness that I invite the reader to engage in through that essay. So the title essay, Creep, comes last. And that choice was incredibly intentional. So in Creep, I'm trying to create a place, that I'm inviting readers into this place. And it's my vision of California. And I'm inviting readers into my genealogy. And I'm showing readers who my family is, what cultures I'm embedded within, who are my literary idols, who are the various villains who've also shaped me. And then we arrive at Creep. And Creep is a chronicle of my experience with intimate partner violence. And I wrote that chronicle for a very simple reason. And it's that when I first began to disclose what I had experienced, people did not want to listen, or they flat out denied that it had happened altogether. I would be told, well, you know, perpetrator's name, he's incredibly charming. Charming people don't behave this way. So I was being gaslit and fed so many different sort of victim-blaming myths. And so I wanted, kind of like Desiree wanted to have a counter-narrative, I wanted my narrative too. And so I set out to document what happened to me. And I took a very different approach to that documentation in contrast with Mean. So Mean is a book that I wrote before Creep, but I reference it quite a bit in Creep. Mean is in some ways about a sexual assault that I experienced when I was 19, and it was perpetrated by a stranger who went on to brutally murder a woman. and he was caught trying to abduct another woman. So we can reasonably kind of, I think it's reasonable to think that he could have gone on to become a serial killer had he not been caught. So so in that book, in Mean, I presented sort of a moral challenge to the reader. When I get to the rape incident itself, I do not provide details to the reader. Mm-hmm. And I do that intentionally. I write as a very unlikable narrator, and then I offer to them that this has happened to me. And so it's this challenge. Can you have compassion for this unlikable individual who doesn't tell you the story, who doesn't give you everything? And some people can't. They want everything. They want to see you bleed before they hand you the Band-Aid or the gauze or whatever it is. And I said, no, you don't get to see me bleed. But can you still have compassion? So Creep is very different in that I kind of do the opposite.
Yeah.
I am extremely graphic about what was done to me. And one of the reasons that I get so graphic in that essay is because when I was experiencing IPV and I began to look at the literature, including forensic literature, to try to understand what was happening to me, I was looking for validation that what was happening to me was wrong, and I was looking for a name. I was looking for language.
Yeah.
And so often I would come across accounts that were either euphemistic or that gave a peek through a window, so to speak. So you got a scene, right? You got to peek into a scene of domestic violence. And ironically, a lot of what I was reading focused on psychological aggression as opposed to physical violence and sexual violence. And I think that the pendulum swings back and forth when it comes to battered women. There are times when narratives become heavy on psychological aggression in order to have it be known that IPV is about control. But I think sometimes when the psychological aggression is overemphasized, we lose sight of the fact that people are being murdered and people are being raped by people who claim to love them.
Yeah.
And so, so some of what I was reading was like so euphemistic or so purged of violence that I started wondering, am I going through domestic violence? Because there's no violence in some of these narratives. And then eventually I did find some writing that very much mirrored what I was experiencing, and it was written by Evan Stark, who is a forensic sociologist, I want to say at Yale. And he wrote a book on coercive control and the entrapment of women. And he has a new book coming out on coercive control and child abuse. Wow. So it was his work that really assisted me. And so I'm inviting people to bear witness to that violence because I know it makes people incredibly uncomfortable, but we have to confront it in order to be able to kill it.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah. It's important to good questions. It's important to exactly what you said. Like I said, I find that your entire book just incredible, but that essay really
Thank you.
It moved a needle, I think.
Thank you.
And your work is very important, and you're my favorite writer, so you get to watch me stan. Every time we talk, I'm just standing.
Look how badly I'm blushing.
Oh my gosh, are you okay? So we have some questions.
Yay,
Would you like me to read them?
Yeah.
Okay. Ari, chapter 4. I was named after my abuelo, but as I grew older and got to know him, I wished I was named after my abuela. Your reflection helped me reflect. Can you speak to what writing about our elders, ancestors offers you/us? Fucking great question.
I have always loved listening to my elders. I know that there are some people who run from their elders and don't want to hear stories, But I've always been like one of those kids that wants to pull up next to grandma and wants to hear all of grandma's stories. And there's so much value in listening to elders. And so, like I said earlier, I appealed to my elders for guidance in the creation of this book. And through that appeal, they inserted themselves into the book very, very strongly. And I descend from people who have not been the main character in history books, and who also haven't been the main character in a lot of fiction. And so I wanted to properly elevate them and make them that. Yeah.
Great. Okay, next question is, when did you think of your mom as a person and not just as your mom? These questions are amazing.
Oh my God.
That's
Whoa.
so deep.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Okay.
Yo, you gotta keep this.
Dang.
You gotta keep that one.
I'm kind of scared of this. Oh my God. I don't know that I had like a particular moment when I was like, she's human. But you know what I think it was, where I just had like this tenderness for her as somebody who was gonna die. Like, so I think that like when we're children, we often think of ourselves and our families as like immortal, right? And I've always considered my mom to be like super, super beautiful. She just has like this really beautiful face. I remember she used to get teased for looking kind of like Susan Lucci. Do you know who Susan Lucci is? The soap opera actress? Yeah, what was the Young and the Restless? Was it Young and the All My Children, All My Children. I remember one time somebody said, you look like the bitch from All My Children. That was it. That's what they said to my mom. But my mom kind of did look like her. And so my mom got a lot of attention for her beauty, right? And then I remember one day noticing that my mom was getting the waddle. Do you know what I'm talking about? She was getting the turkey thing. And I was like, oh my God, my mom's decomposing. Not decomposing, but like she's starting to fall apart a little bit, and she's just gonna keep falling apart. And it was seeing those cracks in her beauty that like caused me a little bit of distress, because I was like, oh, the rose is wilting. You know what I mean? Like, but I love her. Like, I love my mom. Like, like I love my mom. My mom is such an amazing person. She's like kind of like a sprite. You know what I mean? Like she's like an elf. Yeah.
Okay, next question is, I recently saw graffiti in NYC that said 85% of female murder victims who know the man who killed them. Is this true?
I can't remember the statistic, but it's up there. So that's like, it might not be on the nose, but most of us, if we are murdered by somebody, we absolutely know who it was. And not only that, it's usually somebody who told you that he loved you and gave you flowers and chocolates at some point in time. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Yep. So, I mean, yeah.
Wish I had that statistic off the top
Yeah, I
of
don't
my
have
head,
the statistic off the top of my head. That'll be something that I'll have to look up. I can quote this statistic off the top of my head. So when it comes to intimate partner violence, about 35% of straight women or heterosexual women, according to the CDC, report that they've experienced stalking, rape, or IPV at some point in their lives. For lesbians, it's 44%, and for bisexuals, it's 61%.
Wow.
For bisexual women. So there's like a unique sort of like bisexual misogyny.
Yeah.
That puts us, I'm a bisexual woman, at very high risk for stalking, rape, and IPV. And so for us, it's not a matter of if, but when.
Yeah. Wow. That's something
Yeah.
to unpack. Okay, the last question, not to move on so tersely, but we're running. I don't know. Okay. The last question is, what inspired the collection as a whole?
So the collection was inspired by that chronicle of my survivorship. And then what I wanted to do was build sort of around that chronicle. And I wanted to tell the story of what had happened and how I had survived IPV. But again, I wanted to do it in a sociological fashion where I'm not so much looking inward as I am outward and explaining how all of these systems conspired in order to assist the perpetrator in trapping me. And with that in mind, I wanted to write similar essays that were also sociological, but that felt like very sort of conversational storytelling that did the same, that showed how systems, institutions, agencies, and then individuals conspire in order to perpetrate harm.
Did you write the last essay first?
Yes. So I wrote Creep first because it needed to be taught. It needed to be strong before I could work backwards.
Yeah.
And then weave everything together.
Is it it's the longest one in
Yes,
there, right?
it's the longest essay in the book, yeah.
How long did it take you to write? Both the essay and the book?
So I think that the Creep essay took me about a year because it was really emotionally difficult to write. And then maybe about another year for the rest to come together.
You have a lot more citations and notes in the back than most personal sort of writing. Yeah. How deep was your research? Like were you like in the stacks?
So I did a lot of research. I reached out to a lot of folks. I conducted interviews. With like a lot of family members. So I was at times like in libraries or archives, but there's so much that is now digitized. That I was able to access archives digitally. And then there were also some historians who I reached out to in order to especially discuss Mexican history. And who also shared some material with me that was really useful, especially with the essay on my grandfather.
That's also a good segue. Is it segue? I always want to say segue, and then it's like it's segue? 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 This is like the one thing that I can... Anyway, so whatever that is, into this next question, which is, how has your family reacted to your writing and books?
They don't really react to it because they don't read it. Because I tell them not to. Like what I do is I tell them, you guys lived through this. Why do you need to read it? And they're like, oh, that's a good point. But I also tell them, like, my mom doesn't need to read an account of me surviving IPV. You know what I mean? It's like she was with me as it was happening, and she's still horrified by it. And so so I will tell them like what the content is, but I don't think they're going to read this book. Although like there's other work that I will share with them. So if I know that, or if I can trust that it's not going to be painful for them to read some work, I'll share that with them. But I think if the pain is going to be unnecessary, I warn them. And they usually abide by the warning. They follow the warning. And then my sister reads my work. And she's enthusiastic about it. My brother is enthusiastic that I'm a writer. but not so much about the work. But that's because like my brother reads speculative fiction, so it's like that's not what I'm doing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I don't think that what I do kind of appeals to him. And then my cousin Desiree is like super excited about the essay on her.
Yeah.
And then like a lot of my family is in Mexico and they don't read English, but the book's gonna be translated.
Oh,
so
no.
we'll see what happens then.
You're going to have to like not go home for a little while.
Correct.
I had a question about your sister, your sister and brother are in the book.
Yes.
How do they feel about reading about themselves in your work? It's obviously sort of a fraught.
Yeah. So like my brother and sister appeared much more in the last book, Mean, because that book is so much about like my coming of age and about my childhood.
Yeah.
And it's kind of impossible to write about one's childhood if you lived with your siblings and to write around your siblings, you know? So they're there. And I spoke to both of them too when I was writing Mean, because, for example, I write about my sister having had an eating disorder. And so I spoke to her and I asked her, do I have permission to write about this? And she gave me permission. She was enthusiastic, actually. So that was her. And then, again, like my brother has other things to do. My brother's really into like computers, martial arts, and reptiles. Like this is not for my brother.
Wow. Those are three very brother things.
Right? Yeah. Totally. And then I have uncles who are the same. It's like they're clones of the same person. Yeah.
I think we're getting close to time. Is there anything that you want your readers to know? To take away overall from your...
So one thing that I would kindly ask readers to do is to read the essays in sequence, because the sequence matters. The sequence is almost part of the content. So I would invite from start to finish as opposed to leaping about. Yeah.
It's very rewarding to do that.
Thank you.
It is very rewarding. You're the best writer. Just standing again, but like my favorite writer. I guess that is all, and you will be signing books after?
Yay, yeah. That's perfect.
Great. Everyone buy this book. Oh my God. Cool. Do you want your
I'm good.